Hi, we're about to go through the second subheading of the third subheading of Chapter 34, End of the War. We are talking about U.S. intervention and the collapse of the Central Powers. Um, so the U.S. entering World War I is going to be a huge turning point. Now, what happens is that the U.S. at this point was still had a lot of feelings of wanting to be interventionists, wanting to control the Western Hemisphere. They wanted to stay away from the issues happening in Europe. However, World War I is also going to be where the United States is going to start to really improve economically, and they're going to make a lot of money off of the war. They're going to sell things to both sides, both the Allies and the Central Powers. But over time, more and more the goods are going to be going to the Allied powers. Their debts into American banks is really going to make the U.S. want to have them win the war because that gives them the best chance of getting paid back. What's going to lead to the U.S. eventually entering are basically going to be two things. One of which is going to be the German blockade, which is going to interfere with trade, both in with Britain and other areas of the world. So the blockades are going to be an issue. There's going to be a lot of U-boats, which you should have heard about in the other area, which is we would think of as submarines today. And so one of the things that they would do is they would shoot down obviously military vessels or things carrying military goods. And so one of those ships that are going to be shot down is the Lusitania. In May of 1915, about 1,100 people will die, 128 of which were American citizens. It's going to be a huge news story in the United States and helping to kind of shift the public idea of wanting to be against the Central Powers, even if we weren't in the war. It's going to be sensationalized. They're going to hide this fact for a while, but what will eventually come out is that the Lusitania, yes, had passengers on it, but also did have some military munitions on it. So it could be partially justified of them shooting it down. Horrible tragedy, but that was happening. The thing that your book didn't talk about, so your book talks and really focuses on the U.S. wanting to get their money and how it was interfering with trade at the time. But another one that I'm not sure why they don't include is the Zimmermann telegram, which is going to be a huge part of why from other sources I've read, on the U.S. getting involved. See, the Zimmermann telegram is going to be sent in January of 1917, and it's going to be from Germany to Mexico saying, hey, Mexico, it is absolutely horrible how those horrible Americans took so much of your land. If you ever wanted to get that land back, we would be happy to help finance you in doing so. And Britain intercepts that telegram because they desperately want the U.S. in the war and immediately try to get it out. And once it's verified, that's going to be another thing that's really going to kind of push Americans to want to be a part of this. Because clearly, if Germany is going to help finance the enemies of the United States, we can't just hide anymore. So we have to get involved. So U.S. is going to declare war in April 1917, and they are going to be a big boon to the Allied powers. By the fall of 1918, a little over a year later, the Central Powers are just beyond exhausted. It becomes, although they haven't lost ground really on the Western Front, they are teetering on doing so. And eventually it's going to happen. And so what's going to happen is the Central Powers are going to sign an armistice, essentially to kind of sum it up. Germany, especially, is what we usually concentrate on here. And the armistice is that, hey, we will stop fighting on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And so the Great War doesn't end with a decisive battle. It ends with a whimper as bureaucrats have just signed it out of existence, which will cause all sorts of issues. We'll talk about that later. Another thing that's huge is that like the whole world was tired, and we'll get again this into the next chapter. But another thing is a huge influenza pandemic, which you probably have heard about, is going to happen around this time. It starts actually in the United States. It actually dies down after the first wave. And then one of the things that causes another big spike in it is the end of World War One, with troops returning and other people around the world wanting to be close together again. Eventually, that influenza pandemic is deadlier than the one that we're experiencing right now. We'll talk much more about it later, and it eventually is going to kill more people than the Great War itself.